have run out of cough drops, and usually I can't hardly make it through a lesson without having a cough drop in my mouth. So I'm going to try a cinnamon disc tonight. Only problem with that is it's twice as big. Uh-oh. Thank you, brother.
Got you back. Here's your nose. After my roll.
You must want me to preach a long time.
I'm not a drugstore.
If you have your Bibles, turn it over with me to Romans chapter 11. You heard about the preacher who used to judge his sermons by a cough drop. He put a cough drop in his mouth, and he knew whenever a cough drop was done, it was time for him to quit. And one night, he accidentally got a button in his mouth, and the rumor is he's still going, so I don't know. In Romans chapter 11, we're going to talk about the idea of God's plan for the nation of Israel. And as with many inspired passages, and in fact, even within this book itself, a lot of time God deals with questions before they're ever asked from the reader. And so God, by inspiration, anticipates some questions that might arise in the minds of the readers, maybe even sometimes some objections they might have to what's been said and taught before, and then he addresses it before it ever even has to be asked. And when you study Romans chapter 9 and chapter 10 together, of course, we've been studying the idea of how God used the Jewish nation, how he used Israel to bring about Jesus into the world. And even though he gave them this special law, and even though he had this special descendant come from them, and even though he had great plans for them, they kind of as a general whole, as a nation, rejected God's plan for them. And so naturally the question would arise within the minds of the readers of Paul, well, does that mean that God has washed his hands of the Jews, so to speak? And you know, when you think about the role of Israel and the Jewish nation and how it fit into God's plan to save man, they've really been a group of people who over the years have puzzled different people, you know, both past, I think, present, and future. And a lot of people are confused and interested in, well, what exactly is the role of Israel? What exactly is the role of the nation of the Jews in this plan that God has to save mankind? And what is God's future plan for these people? Now, obviously, I think what we've established thus far in our studies, if you haven't grasped anything else from what Paul has written in the book of Romans, I think you need to at least grasp this, and that is, whenever it came to God's plan to save mankind, it wasn't based upon nationality. It was rather based upon individuals. And individuals, in other words, God didn't ever plan to save an entire nation or an entire race and condemn another nation or another race. But God did plan to save individuals, and God did plan to punish individuals, but that was based upon not their nationality, but whether or not they accepted the Messiah, Jesus Christ, as the Son of God. And so redemption is individually centered, not nationally centered. And if we can keep that in mind as we study Romans chapter 11, I think it will help us better understand what Paul is trying to say here. Now, we often say, or I often say, and probably we often emphasize this, the Jews as a nation rejected Christ. That thing go to act up again? You want it off or on? I didn't ask you. You guys want it off or on? Okay. If you start going to seizures, I'll turn it off, okay?
We've already done it 2 or 3 times.
Okay. Maybe they'll hold out for you. We often say that the Jews as a nation rejected Christ. But we, of course, don't mean by that statement that every single individual in the Jewish race rejected Christ. There were still a very small group of Jews who accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And a lot of times we say, well, the Gentiles were receptive to the gospel. And by that we don't mean that the entire Gentile nationality or races accepted Jesus as Christ. There were some individuals who did not. And so it again goes back to this idea that salvation is based upon not nationality, but rather individuals and the choices that they make. And Paul's going to call 5 witnesses to testify as to what God's plan is for Israel within this chapter. The first one that we're going to look at tonight is shown by the example of Paul himself in verse 1. Paul says, beginning, I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people, which he foreknew. Remember, the idea or the question is, since the Jews rebelled against God, has God washed his hand of them as a nation, so to speak? And of course, Paul points out, if every Jew had been rejected because of this, how can you explain my conversion? How can you explain the fact that I have been saved by the blood of Christ? And so the fact that Paul had received forgiveness, the fact that he was given salvation was proof positive that there's still hope for any and every Jew to be saved. And so God did not totally reject Israel. God did not totally wash his hand of them and condemn them all for what they did. The second witness that is called in to testify of this plan for the nation of Israel is the prophet Elijah. And notice in the middle part of verse 2, Paul says, Wot ye not what the scripture saith of Elias, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Paul is again emphasizing this point. It's not the case that God has automatically condemned the entire nation of Israel because of what they chose to do kind of as a nationality. The door of salvation was still open to them. And he talks about the idea here in verse 3, going back to the days of Elijah. Remember how Elijah felt like he was all alone in standing up for God. He felt like he was the only one in Israel who was faithful to God. And he makes a general statement of that nation in verse 3. They have killed thy prophets and digged or torn down thine altars. Now again, that's just a blanket or a general statement about the majority of the nation. Not everybody in Israel was like that. There was a remnant that Paul talks about a little later on in the passage. And in fact, God himself said, well, I have a few left. I have 7,000 within Israel that have not bowed their knee unto Baal. Now, in our minds, we think about 7,000 and we think, well, that's a pretty good number, right? Well, not when you consider the number of the nation, because we're talking about the idea that Israel was over 2 million people in population. And so there was this remnant, there was this small group that was left that was still faithful to God. And then Paul goes on to say, in verse 5, he says, even so, then at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Just like it was in the days of Elijah. The majority of the Jews had rejected Christ. But there was still a remnant, a small population of those Jews who continued to be faithful to God. Now, we know that, and we read about some of the response of the Jews in Acts chapter 2. You remember on the day of Pentecost when Peter and the apostles, it's bugging me, I've got to turn it off, sorry. When Peter and the apostles preached to the Jews, on the day of Pentecost, you have all these devout Jews that have come to Jerusalem under every nation from heaven to observe the day of Pentecost. And then Peter preaches this great sermon to them. And then in verse 41, it says, then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. Now I know a lot of times when we read that, we think, wow, 3,000 people obeyed the gospel. But have you ever stopped to consider how many Jews were there that day? There's no way for us to know for sure exactly how many were there. But it is interesting that the Jewish historian Josephus made an observation about the Jews whenever they attended the Passover feast. Now, this is not the Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, and it's probably likely that there would have been fewer Jews than what was present at the Passover. But he does write about this Passover feast that happened during the days of Nero. And here's what he records. And notice I'm just trying to emphasize the number of Jews that would have been present, that would have heard the gospel preached. He says, and that this city could contain, talking about Jerusalem, so many people in it is manifest by the number of them which was taken under Cestius, who being desirous of informing Nero of the power of the city, entreated the high priest, if the thing were possible, to take the number of their whole multitude. So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called the Passover, found the number of sacrifices was 256,500, which upon the allowance of no more than 10 that feast together, amounts to 2,700,200 persons that were pure and holy. So Josephus is talking about how many sacrifices. The priests couldn't count all the people that were there, but they could count the number of sacrifices that they would offer. And based upon the idea that a group was no less than 10 and no more than 20, which was basically what the Jews observed, a family unit, then that would put that somewhere over 2 million people that were present during that time in Jerusalem. So if you think about that, now again, I don't know exactly how many Jews were there, but I would say that it is very possible that there were still over 2 million people that were there during the day of Pentecost. And only 3,000 of them obeyed the gospel. Percentage-wise, that's not very big, is it? You know, you're only talking about 0.15% of the people that were there, the Jews that were there, that obeyed the gospel. There's a remnant, God says, that has remained faithful. And, to us today, it would be like preaching to a crowd. If you had 667 people in the crowd and one person obeyed the gospel, would we say, wow, that's amazing? We would say, should have been more, right? And the idea is there was a faithful group of Jews within that nation, but it was always very small. It was just like in the days of Elijah, where there were millions within the nation, but there were only 7,000 who had not bowed their knee to Baal. And so the prophet Elijah testifies that a remnant is faithful to God. A remnant is going to be saved. Notice what he says in verse 6. And if by grace, then, it is no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then it is of no more grace, otherwise work is no more work. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. You know, it's interesting that he talks about this idea about how they were saved. They were saved by the grace of God. It wasn't by the works of the law of Moses, like many of these Jews were seeking justification and salvation by, but it was by and through the grace, the unmerited favor of God in sending his Son to this earth to die for their sins. And so that's where their salvation lied. Israel was seeking to be God's children. Israel was looking for salvation, but yet they had not obtained it. He talks about how the rest of the people, there was a remnant that was faithful to God. There was a remnant that didn't bow the knee. There was a remnant that gladly received the word of God and were baptized. But the rest of them were blinded. And so God, through his infinite wisdom, chose to save a remnant of Israel who were faithful to him. They were going to get what they were looking for, but the rest of that nation, he said, was blinded. Well, the point that he's driving at here is God didn't forever cast off his people at this point in time. It's always been like it's been. There's always been a remnant that have been faithful to God. In verse 8, he says, according as it is written, God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear unto this day. We talked about how the rest of the nation had, their hearts had become hardened. They would no longer listen to God. They would no longer see the truth. And so they had become hardened and blinded to the truth itself. And in verse 9 he says, and David said, let their table be made a snare, and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back always. You know, the idea of a table, what do you put on a table? Well, you put the physical blessings that God has given you in this life, and that nourishes you and gives life to your body. Well, in a spiritual application of it, he's talking about all the spiritual blessings that God had poured out upon the Jews. All these things that were supposed to be bringing them life was actually a snare to them. It had become a trap to them, and it had become a stumbling block. You know, we've talked about throughout the last few chapters in Romans how the law should have been a springboard, if you will, to get them to Christ and to get them to the system of faith where they could stand right and be forgiven of their sins in the sight of God. But the very thing that was supposed to be a physical blessing to them had actually become what they had stumbled at. They held on to that law. They wanted to be saved by that law, to find salvation in it so badly that they were not willing to let it go. They were not willing to accept Jesus as the Messiah of mankind. And so the law became their hang-up. The law became the thing that they stumbled at, that they trusted in. And so the prophet Elijah testified long ago, there's always a remnant of God's people that are going to be faithful, of the nation of Israel that's going to be saved. And again, it wasn't based upon the fact that they were Jewish. It wasn't based upon the fact that of their nationality, but it was based upon their individual obedience or disobedience. The next thing that he brings into view is the Gentile populace. Notice in verse 11, he says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. If by any means I may prove to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Did the gospel being taken to the Gentile mean that God had given up on the Jew? Well, no. We studied last week how this was all part of the infinite wisdom of God in provoking the Jews to jealousy. By sending the gospel to the Gentiles, God saw and God was hoping to accomplish a greater salvation of the Jewish nation by making them jealous of all these spiritual blessings that are being poured out upon the Gentile nations. And so within their mind, they should have said, we want to be part of those spiritual blessings too. We want to have those same blessings that all these other nations have also. And, when you read through this chapter, there's obviously a few verses that are used within the religious world where people will talk about this mass conversion of the nation of Israel, of this mass conversion of the Jews themselves. And so their view is that someday there's going to be like a national awakening of this nation and all the Jews are going to be saved. Now, if that happens, great. I'd be the first to jump on board with that. But what I want to emphasize to you tonight is not whether it will or will not happen. I don't think that's what Paul's talking about here. But how is it going to happen? And the only way that the entire Jewish nation is going to be saved is by accepting Jesus as the Messiah, by obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. There is no other way for a man to be saved. And that's the emphasis that Paul is pouring out here. Why did that small group of people, why were they going to be saved of Israel? Because they were faithful. They were obedient to God. And so if it is going to happen, it's going to happen through the preaching of the gospel rather than just this mass chaos of God just arbitrarily saving the Jews. But the greater the effort that was, the more the Jews rejected the gospel, the greater the effort of the populace was made toward the Gentile nation. And so just because the Jews were rejected and just because the gospel had been sent to the Gentile didn't mean that every other nation was going to be accepted, but the Jews had been stamped out of God's plan. They didn't have any chance of being saved. And again, the emphasis throughout the chapter is only the obedient individual is the one that's going to be saved. That was God's plan for every other nation, and it was God's plan for the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel also. Notice beginning in verse 16, he brings the Jewish patriarchs in to testify as to this plan that God has for Israel. In verse 16 he says, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt then say, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut off of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Now what Paul does here is he compares the Jews to this natural olive tree, and then he compares the Gentiles to a wild olive tree. And he begins, notice, when he begins there in verse 16, he begins talking about the first fruits. And he talks about the lump being holy. First of all, he's talking about the idea of dough to start with. But if you're familiar with the idea of the first fruits, the first fruits under the Old Testament, the first fruits were the first incoming fruits of a harvest. And those first fruits always belonged to God. They were always dedicated to God. And what happened is, whenever you dedicated the first fruits to God, then that basically made all the other harvest holy. That basically sanctified all the other that you were going to receive. So it made it acceptable in the sight of God. Well, the Jews were, if you will, this natural olive tree. And then the Gentiles were this wild olive tree. And what happened in the natural olive tree? Well, some of the branches were broken off. Why were some of the Jews broken off from the source of life? Why were they broken off from the root that could nourish them and sustain them and make sure that they brought forth fruit? Well, he explains very clearly for us in verse 20. He says, because of unbelief, they were broken off. And then in talking about the Gentile, he goes on to say, and thou standest by faith. How is it that the Gentiles were grafted in to benefit from this tree and from this root? It was through faith. It was through their belief. And so once again, you have this idea of individuality, not nationality. Some of the Jews were broken off. Why? Because individually they did not obey. They did not believe God. Some of the Gentiles were grafted in. Why? Because individually, not because of their nationality, but because individually, some of them obeyed Jesus Christ. And so they were grafted into the tree. You know, some people see Abraham as the root, and that may very well be, because Abraham was kind of the father of the Jewish nation, the father of Israel. And he was the one through which all this giant tree did grow and did descend. But the point I think that Paul is making here is for the Gentile. And he's saying, don't think that you're better off than the Jews just because you're a Gentile. Right? A Jew can be broken off the tree. A Gentile can be grafted in, but it's not because of their nationality. It's because of their belief or their unbelief. So don't think that simply because you're a Gentile, now you're better off than the Jews because they rejected Christ and put him to death. And so the basis of the removal of the branches was unbelief. The basis of being grafted in was belief. Now, another thing I think that Paul is emphasizing here is the Gentile didn't really have any room to boast because the Jews were the one who brought Christ into the world. And that may be the main point that he's making here. You remember the statement that Jesus made in John 4:22 to the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. He said, "Ye worship, ye know not what. We know what we worship," speaking of the Jews, because he says salvation is of the Jews. In other words, salvation was to come through the Jewish race. And so why is it that a Gentile was grafted in today? It was because the Jews brought Christ into the world, right? So don't be high-minded, is what he's saying. Don't think that you've done this all on your own. Don't think that you don't owe a sense of debt to this nation, because they were the ones who did bring the Christ into the world. And so don't boast of your spiritual position is basically the point that Paul's making to them. A Jew can occupy your position if they believe too. You're not better off than any Jew. And then the last witness that he really brings in is the witness of God himself, beginning in verse 25. He said, "For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. As concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes, but as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sake. For the gifts and calling of God are without repentance. For as ye in times past have not believed God, yet now have obtained mercy through their unbelief, even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they also may obtain mercy. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. You know, Paul saves his best witness for last, and of course that is the witness of God. And basically what Paul is saying here is something we've already covered, but this idea of the physical Israel rejecting Jesus and rejecting the gospel so that the gospel could be carried to the Gentile was part of God's plan all along. And it wasn't a punishment, if you will, upon the Jew, and that's really what he's emphasizing. It was to bring mercy to the Jewish nation. Remember what the hope was by taking the gospel to the Gentile? It was that more Jews would be saved. It was that they would respond out of jealousy and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the idea is God in his infinite wisdom foresaw the Jews rejecting him and his plan, and through it he planned to have mercy brought to the Gentiles. But at the same idea with the mercy being brought to the Gentiles, he was also bringing mercy to the Jews by allowing them to become jealous and provoking them. And so the point that he's making through all of it is they can still be saved. And it's God's plan to try to save them. That's what he's trying to accomplish through the gospel being carried to the Gentile. Now I want you to look at the last few verses with me here as Paul concludes the chapter. In verse 33 he says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord? Or who hath been his counselor? Or who hath first given to him, and it shall not be recompensed unto him again? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen." You know, Paul has just explained this great plan of salvation that God had, not only for the Jew, not only showing mercy for the Gentiles, but also showing mercy unto the Jews. And all Paul can do at the end is basically this is a hymn of praise. And so he bursts out in this hymn of praise, this inspired hymn of praise that magnifies the wisdom and the knowledge of God. Only a God as wise as our God could take the fall of Israel and turn it into salvation for the entire world. There is no human being, he talks about, that can fully know the mind of the Lord. And the more that we study his ways, the more praise we offer up unto him. And so Paul kind of ends this chapter with this idea. Are we to conclude that God doesn't know what he's doing in this great plan for mankind? Are we to conclude that Israel rejecting Jesus has somehow destroyed this magnificent plan that God had for all of mankind? And the answer is, of course not. God is too smart to be overruled by the choices of a nation or the choices of an individual. And so this was part of God's plan all along. What does God's plan for Israel? Well, his plan is for Israel is for like every other nation. It's that every person within that nation will be saved. It is interesting. I want to go back just a minute in verse 26 and talk about this verse very quickly. "And so all Israel shall be saved." That's one of the sugar stick passages of denominationalism today. They'll pick it up and say right there, all Israel is going to be saved. That's what God's plan is for them. Notice what that verse actually says. "And so is in this manner. In this manner, all Israel shall be saved." It's an adverb. "There shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob." How are that all Israel going to be saved? Well, it's through the deliverer. It's through the Messiah. It's through accepting and obeying the gospel of Christ. And that doesn't mean the entire nation is going to be saved. Paul addresses that time and time again throughout the book of Romans. Those who are Jews are not those who are physical. Those who are Israel are not the physical nation. Those who are the children of God are not the descendants of Abraham, time and time again. And so he's really talking about spiritual Israel. All Israel is going to be saved. And the way that they're going to be saved is by accepting Jesus as the Messiah, obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, God's plan for that great nation was to save as many as he could, just like any other nation. How was he going to accomplish it? None other than through Jesus Christ and the gospel that was preached to them. Maybe there's one here tonight who's not yet a child of God. The invitation of God is open for you now to become one if you believe that Jesus Christ is God's Son. You're willing to confess that with your mouth. You've determined in your mind to turn away from sin. Then you're ready to be baptized in water for the remission of your sins. If you're here, you've not been living faithfully, and you need to make a public response, we would plead with you to please come forward.